This Honorable Court of Criminal Appeals of Tennessee is now in session.
Welcome, everyone, to the call of the May docket in Jackson, Tennessee. Mr. Clerk, if you will, just go ahead and call the case, and I'll talk to the attorneys after you've left.
State of Tennessee versus Jerry Carter, Sr.
It's my pleasure today to introduce the panel, distinguished judges that we have to serve today. On your left and my right, from Murrayville, Blount County, Tennessee, the Honorable Judge Kelly Thomas, and our newest judge from Clarksville, Tennessee, Judge Jill Ayers. She was served with distinction as a trial judge before joining us by the appointment of Governor Lee and the confirmation of both the Senate and the House. And we're delighted to have her with us. We also are thankful that for the steps taken by the clerk's office and the LC office to keep us going. Also, the attorneys that are participating today had to take extra steps to do present their cases by Zoom. We appreciate that. We've had some technical difficulties this morning. Should they persist, we'll just be patient with us. We'll be right back in a moment. The protocol for this type of argument is the same as if we were in person, 20 minutes aside. The appellate can reserve time for rebuttal upon introducing himself to the court. So with that, Mr. Appellate, it's your time and it starts now.
Hey, please the court. My name is Ramon Damas and I represent the appellate Jerry Carter. At this time, I'd like to reserve 3 minutes for rebuttal.
Yes, sir.
We have, in this case, we have one issue that's really at issue, and that's the issue regarding the admissibility of Mr. Carter's prior conviction and the hearing involving the 404B issues that result from that. And from that hearing, from that ruling regarding the admissibility is where we have several other issues that branch out from that situation. I think because it is a 404B situation, I think it's important to just kind of give the court a brief overview of what the facts going into this was and what are the problems with the trial court's ruling on these facts. Mr. Carter had a prior 2003 statutory rape conviction that occurred in Shelby County. At his rape of a child case, which the case at issue here, we had a extensive 404B hearing on the admissibility of that prior conviction. The prior conviction did not involve the current victims of Mr. Carter's children in this case, but it did involve a 12-year-old babysitter of the Carters at the time that the event occurred back in 2003. The court heard extensive facts, extensive information about that prior conviction, what were the issues involving admitting that, and the court erroneously relied on the wrong standard. So when we look at 404B, we know that there's 4 things that a court must comply with in order for that hearing to be proper. It has to be outside of the jury's presence. It has to be over a material issue. The court has to be satisfied by clear and convincing evidence that the prior conviction existed. And then lastly, the probative value of that conviction has to outweigh the prejudicial value. Now, the court did substantially comply with the requirements of the 404B hearing in that it went through the factors, the elements of a 404B hearing, except when it gets to the 4th element, which is whether or not the probative value outweighs the prejudicial value. And when we look at the record on Volume 1, page 48, the court gives its reasoning. The court states that the prejudicial value here only merely outweighs the probative value of the conviction, and therefore it's allowed in, it's admissible.
What was
court,
it admissible? What did the trial court find it admissible to show?
the court found it admissible to show, in his words, to complete the story, the context of the case. Now, it is our position that that was also incorrect, that the prior conviction didn't show or complete the story of the case at hand. And that's because at the time that the court made that ruling, it wasn't relying on all of the facts. There was a misunderstanding as to what were the facts surrounding the 2003 events. And I call it an event because there's a lot going on in 2003. In 2003, Mr. Carter gets convicted of statutory rape. A few months afterwards, I believe, the children are taken into DCS for a forensic interview regarding separate but somewhat related events to the 2003 conviction. What had happened in 2003 is that the children had been acting out sexually. The daughter of Mr. Carter, Breonna Carter, or Destiny Carter, had, at the time she was 4 years old, bit her brother's penis while showering, and that prompted the children to be taken to the hospital. Once at the hospital, the nurses there reported it to DCS, and the children were brought in for a DCS forensic interview. The way that is tangibly related to Mr. Carter's conviction is that during the intake process, the forensic interviewers find out that the children were present in the home when Mr. Carter had a sexual encounter with the babysitter, and they believe that that might have been the reason they were acting out. And so the trial court didn't know all of that information when it ruled that the prior conviction was necessary to show the context and full picture, but it also relied on a couple of other factors. I know that at trial, one of the defenses was that Mrs. Carter, the mother of the children, had previously, in about 2007, 2010, around that time, had falsely accused Mr. Carter of having sexual relations with another family member in Arkansas. And I say falsely because it was then later proven at the Arkansas trial that the family members had been paid off by Mrs. Carter. Now, none of this information was allowed at trial to be cross-examined on, brought into evidence, or even mentioned to the jury. And that is specifically because the trial court, when issuing its ruling on the admissibility of Mr. Carter's prior conviction, said this will be admissible if the defense attempts to cross-examine Mrs. Carter or attempts to bring any sort of information that there was a false accusation in 2007. I will allow this prior conviction to come in to explain the story as to why those actions were made.
So was the conviction entered? Was the prior conviction entered and presented to the jury?
No, Your Honor, it was not. However, the court kept using the threat of admitting the conviction as a way to stifle the defense's attempt to present any sort of defense. The whole defense's theory of the case was that the reasons these allegations were being made now, I think at the time the allegations were made, it was around 2015, that the reason those allegations were made at that time was over this fight, over this issue, over parental rights. So there's all of these facts, and I refer to my brief. There's all of these facts where they had been having this issue about parental rights. Mr. Carter and Mrs. Carter had divorced. They were living in separate states. I believe Mrs. Carter and the children were living in Alabama. And there was, I think, over the summers, the kids were allowed to come spend time with Mr. Carter. Mrs. Carter had remarried, had a new husband, and the new husband wanted to adopt the children, but they couldn't do so without Mr. Carter's terminating his parental rights, for which he refused. And there was a letter written by Mrs. Carter, once again, not allowed into to be admitted at trial because of the threat that the prior conviction would be admitted, that would show that Mrs. Carter was asking for Mr. Carter to terminate his parental rights. And when he refused, she said, well, I'm going to get you for this. There will be repercussions for this. And shortly thereafter, the accusations in Arkansas come out. And as that case was being going through the system, turns out she had paid a family member of the victim to make up these allegations. When that doesn't work, when that fails, this issue of the parental rights once again gets brought up again, and these allegations on which we're currently at in Shelby County were also filed in, I believe, Knoxville, Knox County, where similar allegations were made, and that case was actually dismissed because there was no evidence of the acts, which once again, evidence of that dismissal was not allowed to be admitted into this trial over threat that if so admitted, the trial court would allow the prior conviction of Jerry Carter to come in. The prior conviction on which the standard he relied on to admit was incorrect. The trial court on page 48 of volume 1 of the record states, well, when we look at 403, the 403 standard of relevance, it has to be substantially outweighed in order for it to be not allowed in, for it to be inadmissible. And in this case, we only have a mere outweighting of the prejudicial value, which is the incorrect standard. When you look at 404B 4, it states if the probative value is outweighed by the prejudicial value, it must not be allowed in. And that's just on a regular conviction. And here we have a prior sex crime conviction being allowed in, or being tentatively allowed in a trial for excess crime. When we look at State v. Rodriguez, the Tennessee Supreme Court said sex crimes specifically are special. And in that case, it ruled that it was error for a trial court to allow evidence that the defendant had possession of child pornography, for that to be allowed in a rape of a child case. This case is extremely analogous to that. We have a rape of a child case where evidence of a prior stat rape is being threatened to be allowed in if the defense attempts to present any sort of defense, if it attempts to confront its witnesses with evidence of bias or impeachment materials, if it attempted to cross-examine the state's expert from DCS regarding what was the context in which statements made by the children at the 2003 forensic interview were done, and why specifically those statements were found to be unfounded and perpetrator not substantiated, which leads to the second situation where the trial court is once again using this prior conviction as a guillotine over the defense's ability to cross-examine and to present a defense at trial, which was the 2003 DCS statement. So at the 2003 forensic interviews, the children's make a disclosure, and I use the term disclosure very, very openly here, because it was a disclosure that by DCS standards they were unable to find to be truthful, because some of these statements, some of these other statements they were making didn't make any sort of sense at all for why the children were there. So as I mentioned previously, the children were taken to this forensic interview because Breonna Carter had bit Carter Jr.'s penis while they were showering. When the children were asked about these questions and have you ever, been touched before, or has anybody ever been inappropriate with you? One, Breonna Carter denies ever biting Jerry Jr.'s penis, but says that she did touch it or something along those lines. And then when Jerry Jr. is asked about the situation, he completely misstates his age. I think he was 7 years old at the time, and he states he was like 11 or 15, and then completely denies any sort of wrongdoing. Now, the state's theory was that these references to a Jerry, penis being bitten, penis being touched, was Jerry Carter Sr., and that the children simply weren't believed at the time that they made these disclosures. But when we look at the record, which the court finally did look at it, when Ms. Harper was on the stand, he realized his mistake. He says, "Oh, I completely understand, Mr. Ferguson, where you're coming from. I had not read that portion." And in fact, the state hadn't read that portion, where the reference is clear that the Jerry in question is her older brother. Nonetheless, the court stated that if the defense planned to cross-examine Ms. Harper on clarifying the rest of the context of those statements, then the state would be able to say that the reason Miss Breonna Carter bit Mr. Jerry's her brother's penis was because they had learned that behavior from the father, which is inappropriate. It's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with what the actual facts were. And so throughout this whole trial, the trial court kept using the prior conviction as a whip to keep the defense in line. Well, don't go into that area, because if you do, you open the door to this conviction, which inherently is inadmissible at this level. And all of this it's the cumulative effect of all of these rulings, that each time the defense tried to get into a certain section or a section area where he could confront or cross-examine a certain state's witness, the judge will reel the defense back in, saying, "No, if you do that, I'm going to allow the state to come in and bring up evidence of this prior conviction." And in fact, the state did use that to their advantage. So Ms. Harper was allowed to testify that Breonna Carter made a disclosure in 2003 where she specifically references a Jerry and touching his penis. And in their closing,
you're getting into your rebuttal time now, counselor. You've only got 3 minutes. Use it wisely.
With that, Your Honor, I ask that this court grant a new trial because of the 404B issues. Thank you.
Very well. General.
Good afternoon, Your Honors, and may it please the court, and congratulations on your appointment, Judge Ayers. Ronald Coleman on behalf of the state. First, I've noticed that the defendant has not raised or has not discussed his claim regarding the jury instruction. And so unless this court has any questions on that claim, the state will reserve its argument to the brief on that issue. When we're looking at the other two issues that he has raised, it's important to have some clarification or to sort of break things down. And really there are 3 points that need to be made. First is when the rulings were made. Second is what those rulings were. And third is what are the issues that have been raised on appeal. And so the first issue that the defendant has raised on appeal deals with this pretrial ruling regarding the admissibility of his prior convictions. And so I think we need to look at that as to whether that is a proper evidentiary ruling. And so when you look at what happened there, at that time, the trial court and the parties agreed that the defendant had this prior conviction for conduct towards a babysitter and apparently a third victim in that case, and that the children were interviewed by the Department of Children's Services for those convictions to see if there was anything that he had done to the children as well. And so the defendant actually stated, I'm going to talk to these children. I'm going to bring out that they've made these disclosures beforehand, essentially to point them out as I think to attack their credibility. And the court said, well, if we're going to get into why they were interviewed by DCS, then we're going to have to complete the story. We're going to have to get into why they were interviewed. We don't want to leave that question there. And so we need to have these convictions. At that time, the court's knowledge was they were interviewed because the defendant committed sexual conduct towards other minors. And so.
And that would be prejudicial, I take it, General.
Well, respectfully, I think we can kind of skirt that issue entirely because, to Judge Ayers' point, the convictions never came in. So we're looking at an evidentiary ruling regarding the admissibility of these prior convictions. And so to the extent that anything was an improper ruling, it's irrelevant or it's moot because those convictions never came in. And we have to look at the specific issue that was raised on appeal, which is this was an improper evidentiary ruling. To the extent that that's even correct, it doesn't matter because any error was harmless. When no convictions.
So you would require the defendant to go against the instructions of the court and wade on into those issues and then make the court put those prior convictions into the evidence before he could contest it.
Well, I think that's where things are sort of getting muddied when that's not what happened in the trial court. The issue that has been raised first is this pre-trial ruling. And so the defendant wouldn't have to. That's an evidentiary ruling that the defendant wouldn't have to get into any issues. Based on this pre-trial ruling, the state could have just admitted those convictions and the issue would have been preserved and it would all have been fine. Because those convictions never came in, any error in the ruling was harmless. But I do want to get into that ruling because it was an appropriate ruling. The defendant claims that the trial court misapplied the standard or the balancing act of probative value versus the risk of unfair prejudice. And when this court looks at the record, it will see that that is simply not the case. What the trial court did when it was looking at the 404B factors, it specifically found, okay, we've had a jury out hearing. This is a material issue. I find by clear and convincing evidence that these convictions did in fact occur. And then it got to this balancing act and it said, let's distinguish first. First, it just pointed out there's a distinguished balancing act between Rule 403, which says that it must be substantially outweighed. The probative value must be substantially outweighed by the risk of unfair prejudice. And he said, well, that's not the standard in Rule 404. It's just that the probative value just has to be outweighed in some way, shape, or form. But then it goes on to explicitly find that I think the probative value outweighs the unfair prejudice. That is the appropriate standard.
What was the probative value?
Again, Your Honor, it goes to complete the story. We have when
we often don't like to complete the story because it's just fraught with prejudice and gets the juries confused and it's not relevant to any issue that is being tried, and it's prejudicial to the defendant and cannot be overcome by curative instructions or cautionary instructions. So the complete the story is not just the best legal analysis that I've ever seen. So what reason did the state need to put that into evidence? What were they to show?
So again, Your Honor, I completely understand the cautionary point with regard to completing the story. However, that is a valid point, or that is a valid reason for admitting these convictions under State v. Gilliland. But even if this court were to find that this is just too prejudicial, the point is there was no harmful error. Any error in admitting.
I've got that. But I want to hear from you. I've read it. I think I understand it. But what was the evidence to give to the jury? What did they need to know about that conviction?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it going to tell you identity? It wasn't going to tell you it was propensity.
Respectfully, no, Your Honor. It was to complete the story, and I understand that that's not the best reason. But when you're looking at this pre-trial hearing and what the information before the trial court was at that time, the trial court had the knowledge that the children were interviewed by DCS because of this conviction. That the only reason all
right, right there. Is that relevant to what they said?
So the trial court did not want to leave that question hanging over the jury as to, and I think it could have been even more prejudicial if you left it out to the jury could think, well, maybe he's done this to the kids before this charged period of time. Maybe he's done this to these specific victims. And so Again, you know, the trial court was weighing the probative value versus the risk of unfair prejudice, and, you know, considering whether it was the best practice to even admit these convictions. And ultimately, when it conducted that balancing test, it said that the probative value, the reason to explain this, to get that question out of the jury's head, was more probative than it had any risk of unfair prejudice. And again, I want to point out one more time that these convictions never came in. So when we're looking at the evidentiary ruling of the trial court, the defendant simply cannot obtain relief on that claim because there was no error. He got what he wanted. He thought, or he was arguing, that the convictions should not come in. The convictions did not come in. So he's already obtained the relief that he wanted with regards to that evidentiary rule. Now, when you turn to the other issue, which is the specific claim that his constitutional right to present a defense was violated, then you have to look at sort of the context. And first and foremost, you've got the fact that he was able to present his defense. He was able to cross-examine the mother about the relationship strife and things of that nature, about how she had gotten a new significant other and that they were wanting to get custody of the two victims, in this case, the children, and things of that nature. He was able to cross-examine both of the children on the fact that they did not report this. This was conduct that occurred between 2006 and roughly 2011. And they did not report that until 2013. They didn't report it to their school counselors, to their teachers, to their friends, to their mother, to anyone. And so they were able to present the fact, to impeach the victims based on this lack of reporting. And so first and foremost, the defendant was able to present his defense. And so his constitutional right to present a defense was not violated. And that's the issue on appeal. But even if you look at these warnings by the trial court, it's important to note that that's what they are. They are warnings. They are proactive warnings that the judge is talking about his balancing. And the judge says, you know, if you're going to ask these questions, this is going to change how things go. Trial flows throughout the trial, and the trial court's balancing act can be affected by the questions and the evidence that is administered. So the fact that the trial court was simply proactively warning the defendant that if you get into these areas, this could affect my balancing act, or this could render something else admissible. In fact, that this could open the door, that does not violate his right to present a defense. That was emphasized by our Supreme Court in Vance. And in fact, this court just last year held that, and I'll direct quote, where the record reveals that the trial court limited proof only as it related to opening the door for the state to present potentially damaging evidence, the court did not prevent the defendant from presenting a defense. And I did not include that in my brief, but I can cite it for you now. It's State versus Cox, COX, and that's case number East 2019 00026. And so even if the defendant's claim were accurate, he wasn't denied his right to present a defense. And so I think, again, the trial court is allowed to modify its balancing act and modify its rulings based on how the trial progresses. But even if this was a warning to the defendant that you're going to open the door and this prejudicial information is going to come out, both this court and our Supreme Court have held that does not violate the right to present a defense. That's the only other claim that's on appeal. And so again, the defendant is not entitled to relief on that claim.
Is there evidence that Ms. Carter paid or talked somebody into making a false allegation?
I'm glad you brought that up, Your Honor, because that was discussed extensively today. It was discussed in statements by argument of counsel at the trial, but my recollection of the record is that there's nothing to definitively prove whether this happened, whether there was any payment, things of that nature. I think the state at the pretrial hearing agreed that the defendant was in jail in Arkansas based on some allegations But that's really all I can remember from the record. The record would be more accurate, but it certainly wasn't admitted into trial. But again, I think, when we're looking at the right to present a defense, the mother was still extensively cross-examined about a multitude of things. And so the defendant was able to present his defense, through the mother, through the victims, through the DCS investigators, and these precautionary warnings did not violate his constitutional right to present a defense. If there are no further questions, the state respectfully requests that you affirm the judgments of the trial court. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. You got your 3-minute rebuttal.
Thank you, Your Honors. Very briefly, I'm to address Justice Thomas' question about the proof regarding Mrs. Carter's false allegations. There was no proof admitted at trial, once again, because the trial court stated, if you call this witness, because the defense had a witness ready to testify about those payments, or if you ask Mrs. Carter about that in order to call the impeachment witness, the prior conviction is admissible. And once again, restricting the defense's ability to present a defense to the jury of everything.
My question was that proof out there somewhere that she could have been cross-examined about it and it established by proof that it was true?
Yes, Your Honor. It could have been established by the testimony of the witness that the defense had ready for trial. Once the defense received the ruling from the trial court, obviously it was no longer able to call that witness because it was not allowed to ask that question without.
Was there an offer of proof from the witness or a stipulation about what that witness would have said or anything like that?
Not that I am aware of, Your Honor. I do know that at the time, the gentleman's name escapes me right in this moment, but he was ready and prepared to testify that Mrs. Carter had paid him some sum of money to make these false allegations against Mr. Carter. And that is why that case in Arkansas eventually got dismissed. Specifically addressing the state's issue about the prior convictions never being allowed in, and that based on the ruling, it could have been allowed in and just never came in. Well, the ruling was, if the defense goes down this road, I will allow it in. It wasn't it's allowed and the state chose not to bring it forth. It was specifically stated to the defense, if you ask about these prior disclosures, if you ask Mrs. Carter about the false allegations, if you ask about the 2007 incident with Ezekiel Skinner, the child that was also accused of sexually assaulting Miss Carter, then you open the door to the prior convictions. The defense was not allowed to go into that. The defense was not allowed to cross-examine Mrs. Carter about the multiple times she was forensically interviewed and never disclosed that Mr. Carter had touched her inappropriately during the time that these alleged events were occurring, because if the defense asked that question, the prior conviction would be allowed in. That is very strictly restricting the right to the defense. In addressing Justice Williams' question, well, what's the point of allowing this prior conviction? It's pure and simple. It's propensity evidence. There's no reason. The reason provided by the state that it needs to complete the story was addressed by the defense at trial and said, Judge, I have a perfect solution. You don't want the jury to know that these kids came here for no reason whatsoever. Well, we can tell the jury that Mr. Carter was convicted of something. My only issue is I don't want the jury knowing that he was convicted of a sex crime. We can tell them he was convicted of something, and out of abundance of caution, these children were forensically interviewed, and the judge rejected that. The judge said, no, they need to know that this prior conviction was for statutory rape. And that's not to complete the story. That's simply propensity evidence. And with that, I ask the court once again to reverse the trial court's conviction and set this for a new trial. Thank you.
Thank you both. Well joined, well argued. We'll take it under advisement and we'll retire for the third case of the afternoon at 3:00.
This honorable court is now in recess until 3 p.m.